Motor Vehicles, which is our last but not least effort to wrap up subcommittee activity so that the conference committee can begin its important work under a difficult set of circumstances. Let me just welcome folks back. It's so rare that we get folks who had such a good time the first time, they ask if they can come back and do it a second time, and so the fact that you all wanted to be here is a compliment to the committee, I know. We had one significant change, as I understand it, from our expectation when we were last here, and that is that the staff report indicates that the BCP number 3 in connection with the Real ID issue has been withdrawn by the administration. Is that correct? Could I ask you to just give us 5 minutes worth of background on what that was going to be and what it no longer is, and why the recommendation or the request came forward to withdraw the budget change proposal? And please introduce yourselves again for the committee.
Mr. Chairman, members, George Valverde, Director.
Excuse me, Mr. Valverde. Why don't we call the roll and establish a quorum present?
Sure.
Just for
Simidian?
Present.
Benoit?
Here.
Lowenthal? Here.
Great. You're now talking to an officially constituted subcommittee, Mr. President.
Thank you, sir. Again, George Valverde, Director of the Department of Motor Vehicles, and I have to my right the Chief Information Officer with the department, Bernard Soriano, and to my left, Matt Paulin, the Deputy for Administration. As you know, in 2005, the Congress enacted the Real ID Act, which established requirements upon the states on the issuance of driver's license and ID cards. The threshold was to establish, a nationwide standard relative to the driver's license ID document that we all carry with us. Through that process, though, and as we had many hearings, I think the first hearing that we had was in early 2006, the state identified a considerable cost associated with implementing the requirements of the Real ID Act. At that time, we indicated to complete the process would cost the state of California in excess of $500 million. And the state was obligated to complete that process within a 5-year time frame. And it established, specific dates. I think 2008 of May was the first date that was established by the Congress relative to meeting Real ID requirements. Subsequent to that initial assessment, the Department of Homeland Security went back and evaluated many of the comments that they were getting from the states, had some webinars. In fact, they had one nationwide hearing that coincidentally was here in California at the University of California, Davis. We hosted that event. It was a very successful event in terms of it gave us an opportunity to brief the staff from Homeland Security relative to the process we go through in issuing a driver's license and how much more of that process would be affected by requiring, our 23 million driver's license ID card holders to come into the office and go through the process that they identified. As a result of that, they issued, updated rules and regulations that modified the time frame and established certain thresholds relative to states complying with that. The first threshold was to, indicate the state's interest in moving forward with Real ID, and that had to be met by May of 2008. California, actually submitted a letter indicating that we were still proceeding with what we refer to as best practices, and the legislature, agreed with our approach relative to the degree that it improved our issuance process and reduced the concerns relative to fraud and other issues that were addressed by the Real ID, that California would continue to proceed along that path. Again, the legislature did not indicate that we were going to adopt Real ID, only that to the degree that we adopted best practices and they corresponded with Real ID requirements, that we should continue to do that. Coincidentally, once the rules were adopted and the requirements for material compliance were published, there were 18 specific requirements that were identified that had to be met for states to be determined to meet material compliance. In our review of that assessment, we, the state of California, we believe we met at least 15 of those 18 requirements. There were some areas where we had some significant, concerns about that we indicated that we would not do. For example, providing an indicator of not being a real ID. We indicated we would not, have an indicator on our document specifying that this was not for real ID purposes. So that was an area that we had indicated to Department of Homeland Security that we would not be proposing. Having said that, we did identify some changes that would have some material impact, mostly in terms of our issuance process, and that was the essence of our BCP for the 9/10 period, was to incorporate the cost associated with meeting that material compliance requirement. Now, as a result of recent changes, the change of administration, a new Secretary in Department of Homeland Security, there has been some relaxation or reconsideration of how the real ID should be should proceed. And at this time, we understand that there is some fundamental agreement relative to amending the real ID, and I expect, I've been told, before the end of this month, and actually before Memorial Day vacation for Congress, that we expect there will be legislation that will be introduced that would modify the Real ID Act.
Nothing like a vacation to focus the mind on the important issues of the time. So.
Yes. So consequently, given this, what's going on at the federal level, we felt it was important to, stand back. That doesn't change our approach relative to, again, proceeding with, implementing what we've identified as best practices in our issuance process, and to maintain the standard that California has, maintained relative to ensuring the privacy and protection of our citizens.
Let me just interrupt and see if my summary is consistent with what you've told us, and if it's not, please tell me. So over the past several years, both in anticipation of Real ID and in order to produce a better, more secure document, you've made a number of changes. Some of those changes were designed to simply produce a better document and a better process, sort of standing on their own. But if, as we were doing those changes, we could also make ourselves more compliant with what was either already in place for Real ID or what we anticipated would be in place in Real ID, so much the better.
Yes.
Okay, so then we're at a point where we aren't quite fully compliant, but we're on a path towards being fully compliant, or we're still making progress towards being fully compliant. And with the change in administrations, it now appears that there's maybe an appropriate timeout while we let folks sort out what their expectations are before we figure out what the next set of steps we ought to take is, both that have merit on their own and that would make us fully compliant. Is that
I think that's a reasonable explanation.
Okay. So for that reason, the budget change proposal has been withdrawn.
Yes.
And this is an information-only item.
Yes.
And let me see if we have any questions on this information-only item from my two Senate colleagues. Senator Benoit, anything on this one?
Well, I'm pleased to see that we're not going to be spending the tons of money that was previously discussed in these budget committees on the other side, when I was on the Assembly side. I'm hopeful that we can get close to, if not meeting all of those standards in terms of functionality and proving we know who we're talking to and who we're issuing IDs to, notwithstanding that change. Thank you.
Thank you. And Mr. Belver, if I were to ask you, what's your sense of in terms of the documents that we're turning out today as opposed to 10 years ago, in terms of the changes you've made? Are those dramatic improvements, significant improvements, modest improvements? I know that's a subjective question, but I'm sort of asking you from your standpoint, how much improved is today's document compared to the one that we would have seen a decade ago?
That's a difficult question because, if you put it in the context of our current driver's license contract, our current contract is over 10 years old. So the technology that we adopted 10 years ago is still the technology that we're using today.
Okay.
Having said that, there are other things that we've done in our issuance process, both in terms of the information that we collect, how we store that information, our capability of evaluating fraud and detecting fraud. So we have improved on those aspects of it. But the document, with age, obviously becomes more susceptible to fraud. And that's one of the reasons why it's important for us to move to the next generation of driver's license ID documents.
All right, thank you. What I'm going to do is I'm going to hold off on public testimony on this information-only conversation, just because I think we can fold all the public testimony into the next item. I do, however, want to ask if the LAO or Department of Finance have any comments about the information item, which is the withdrawal of the budget change proposal. Nope. All right. Then we have three items before us today that will require some action. The first is the driver's license ID card contract, BCP1. Then the fee increase for the card contract, which, as I understand it, will necessarily bear some relationship to the decisions we make in the first instance about what it is we're prepared to authorize. And then, more or less unrelated to those two conversations, there is some construction or reservation on state-owned facilities, BCP number 2, that requires our action today. Is that consistent with your understanding of what we're all here to talk about today? Good. All right. Then let's pick it up with the new driver's license and the ID card contract. And not to revisit all of the conversation we had the last time, we had some conversation before about the proposal that you have before us, and the chair and others recognize some indicated some concern about the biometric proposal, and others spoke in support. So, that's a piece, obviously, of the decision we have to make today. There are a couple of other decisions we have to make today. We can say that in the committee's judgment, you know what, limp along with the contract you've got, go for another year, extend it, and just, we'll keep talking. Or we can, as I understand it, and this is, I want to be clear on this, you suggested that if the committee is not amenable to the notion of biometrics at this point in terms of facial recognition, that there is an opportunity to do a new contract, but to sever that piece from the contract. Do I have that understood correctly?
Well, I don't know it would be a new contract. I think it would require us to negotiate the terms and conditions with our existing bidder in terms of what that contract would entail, but we would envision similar scope of work, similar characteristics, and with the modification relative to the the biometric component.
Well, help us get a little more clarity on this, because this was an important issue to you, which was, senators, we have this old system. Please don't make us keep working on this old system. So, one of the possibilities was, as I say, to simply say, take another year. That did not light up your faces. And so we said, all right, is there a way then to allow you to move forward with the contract, but without the biometric element that you've proposed, so that you can have the state-of-the-art, brand-new, whiz-bang technology you want without that one component? And I thought the answer to that was yes. Or are we going to be held hostage and told that we can't have a new system unless we're prepared to accept a biometric issue, which has not had a thorough policy debate? Not to tee it up too precisely for you.
I believe that I want to qualify my yes. Okay, that because of our procurement laws, our procurement requirements, it would require us to go back and negotiate the terms and conditions under a modified agreement. We negotiated an agreement based on certain parameters. That's what has been submitted to the legislature. In order to modify that, we would have to go back and do that. So the answer is yes, but it would take us some time to do that. Under any circumstance, the development component would take us up to 12 months. So if we were to execute that contract today, the earliest I could begin issuing a new driver's license would be 12 months from today. So that's what concerns me, that our current contract expires in June 2010, and given the the nature of our contract and the nature of our equipment that is on its last legs. We're operating on a 486 computer system. Our camera equipment, fails in our offices, and we need to replace that equipment. That's the number one priority.
But Mr. Valverde, again, and I've had this conversation with you both publicly and privately, and I want the committee members, including Mr. Lowenthal and Mr. Benoit, to hear me on this issue. You can't come into, in my view, you cannot walk into this committee in good faith and say, our system is ready to break down and therefore you have to take or leave whatever it is we deliver to you in the way of proposal. And I'm hoping that's not what you're suggesting.
That is not what I'm suggesting.
Just so we're clear about that. Because I don't know whose fault it is that the system is about ready to fall apart, but I'm pretty sure it's not anybody at this table, is it?
I'm not suggesting that.
Okay. Is there someone here from the organization that you have a proposal with who can speak to the willingness and ability of your provider to provide a system that does not incorporate the biometric facial imaging? Please feel free to use the microphone.
Mr. Chairman, Bob Naylor, representing L1 Identity Solutions. Our understanding is consistent with the directors. We are willing and able to provide a system and to negotiate the changes he mentioned.
Great. I take
without
that.
the facial recognition.
Simply a question of sitting down and having that conversation and figuring out what the cost of the product would be minus that component. All right. And let me, before I let you step away, I know other members are interested, so I want to go first to Senator Lowenthal, who looked like he was about to ask a question. Yeah. And then to Senator Benoit. Thank you.
Well, obviously, I think the issues have been laid out by the chair now. Obviously, there are some concerns about facial recognition technology and that it has not gone through the policy committee in any way. So if we were going to delay or remove facial recognition now, first of all, how would the question was asked, how would that impact and the ongoing development of the new driver's license? But the other side of the question is that since there are unanswered questions, and let's say then we prohibit it now, but then we really raise these questions and it does go through the policy committee, could it at some later date then be modified? That's the issue.
And I think that's what we'd have to negotiate.
That is the issue. I think it's very important to negotiate and to get back to this committee because I strongly hear the concerns of the chair on privacy issues. I also believe it should be fully vetted in the policy committee to see whether these are real, and if it is the decision of the legislature at some later date to put it in, I would want you to know that you've been working on that we could redo that while prohibiting it now, if in fact the legislature felt secure after going through the policy.
In my conversations with our contractor has led me to believe that we could negotiate something along those lines. Implementing the contract in its base form, say eliminate, without the biometric component, and just basically some on-off switch that it would be off until, and then whatever date we would determine to execute it, then we could turn it on.
So if the policy committee then decided and the legislature followed that lead to say that these concerns were fully vetted and dealt with later on, you would have that ability, you believe, at least to do them.
Yes.
That satisfies my concerns.
Senator Benoit.
That's consistent with my understanding, Senator.
Thank you. If we can keep you right there, Mr. Naylor.
Appreciate the comments of both the director and the representative for the company, but let me ask you this. The bid process that we went through specified, as I understand it, that the bidder should provide a system that included facial recognition. Is that correct?
That was a mandatory requirement, yes.
So then the question becomes, are there bidders extant who might have bid that couldn't or didn't because they don't have a facial recognition system?
Well, theoretically, yes, but I think because of the nature of the process we went through, which was a negotiated agreement, it eliminated the possibility of other bidders entering into that discussion, because basically in a negotiated contract, you basically put everything on the table. And
my fear is that what you said is exactly accurate, that by that process we eliminated other bidders who could turn around and file a claim that they were unfairly excluded because the bid process required facial recognition, and in the end, we didn't require that.
And I'm relying on the judgment of our procurement staff and the Department of General Services, which is responsible for advising us on procurement matters. And they advised me that the risk of other potential bidders either protesting or raising issues relative to the, modification in the process is pretty remote.
And I accept that, but remote and possible are still in the same realm.
Sure.
And if we did do that, what would be the cost in terms of delay and cost to the state to rebid this process, time and dollars?
Well, the estimates we have is if we had to rebid this, it would take us anywhere from 12 to 14 months going through a new procurement process because this is a major procurement. I don't know if I have a cost estimate. Do we have a cost estimate? No, I don't think we have a cost estimate, but certainly it would take a number of personnel to do that, both from our department standpoint as well as general services perspective.
Thank you.
Along these lines, as long as Senator Benoit has raised them, and please stay with us. I know it's not ergonomically designed, but when this contract was, or a proposal was negotiated, was it with a single vendor? Because I know you've had a vendor in place for a number of years.
We had two bidders and we entered into negotiations with the two bidders.
Okay.
Subsequent to that, the bidders became one.
Okay.
So we ended up, eliminating one of the bidders from the process.
Thank you.
I should add that the size of California, dwarfs any other state, and there's a very limited number of contractors that have the capability of meeting, the technical requirements that California has. So that's why we do have a limited pool of participants when we're talking about, a contract of this nature.
A couple of other issues on the biometric component for the committee. One is I've been in touch with the Legislative Counsel's office. I have not yet asked them to deliver a formal opinion, but based on my conversations with members of the Legislative Counsel's staff, it is my opinion that you probably need specific policy authority by statute in order to go this route. You may have a different view. I understand that there's a different view on the statute, but as I talk through these issues with the Legislative Counsel's office, the conclusion I came to, based on my conversation with members of her staff, is that statutory authority is probably going to be required to go in this direction. So apart from the policy concerns from a sort of purely statutory standpoint, I think it's not only a policy issue. I think you may very well need statutory authority to go in this direction, which would then force the policy debate as well as some of the questions about privacy in an environment where they could be more thoroughly debated. So that issue is there. And then I guess the other question I would have is, because we've spent more time on this issue and I've had an opportunity to get my head inside a little bit more. If I were to say to the information I read says we'd be better off using two fingerprints and a biometric as a biometric identifier rather than one fingerprint and facial recognition. And if I were to say to you, why don't you do that instead? Because the information I read says we'd have 10 times greater reliability if we want to use biometrics using two fingerprints rather than one fingerprint and facial recognition. You would say to us,
well, when we actually were heading down this path of, developing the criteria for the next generation of driver's license, we certainly looked at all the different components that would help improve the integrity of our issuance, and fingerprints was one of them. I think the conclusion of the task force that was worked on this, and that included law enforcement, retail staff, bank advocates, as well as legislative staff that were involved in that task force, that to get an accurate or a reliable reading and using fingerprints, we would need a minimum of 4 prints. And then if you take into consideration capturing 4 prints and then the time it takes to read 4 prints, it did become a cost-benefit question of, first capturing the print, maintaining that information on a database, and then secondly, retrieving that information. And the costs associated with those activities made it much more costly to proceed down that path.
The information I saw suggested that if you had even a second print, you would have a dramatically better identifier than if you had face plus single print, and that, in fact, the reason that you didn't go forward with prints was because there's a specific statutory exclusion for more than the one print.
Well, that's true also, that we would have to modify the statute because the statute only says one fingerprint. And I know the department in the past had proposed, modifying that to incorporate fingerprints, and the legislature did not approve that request.
And the concern I have, and I do not mean this critically of you or your people, but the concern I have is that we may have ended up with facial recognition software on the table as the proposed technology because people said, well, if we want more in the way of identifiers, and this has been specifically prohibited, then the way to get around the specific prohibition is to say instead of using a second or third fingerprint, we'll simply use facial recognition because no one has thought to put that into the code yet.
I don't know that we were so, clever in thinking of it that way, but, I think we looked at it more from a programmatic cost standpoint. And I would agree with you. Pictures is probably not as reliable as prints. And certainly if we had, the capability and, the wherewithal to do it, I would say, yes, let's proceed with the prints.
And again, it's not my intention to suggest that you were clever or too cute by half in terms of the approach. It's more my suggestion that you walked up to the door was locked, and so you walked down the hall, and the next door was open, and that's the one you walked through. I mean, that's sort of the way it works. So anything else from the vendor? Okay. What I would like to do, gentlemen, is anything from LAO on this point in terms of the biometrics, Department of Finance?
I just wanted to clarify that, if there's direction to limit the biometric, that you're talking about the facial recognition biometric.
Yes.
Okay.
Yes.
Thank you.
Okay. And then why don't I ask you gentlemen to step away, take your seats in the front, and let me ask if there are privacy advocates who are here who wish to testify on the issue at this time. Before you begin, I'd like to ask if we have a convenient cluster of 3, if people would just take your seats, tell us who they are and who they represent, and then we'll take you in whatever order you'd like. All right, this dance has to stop, though.
Just a dance.
We'll just
Dance,
keep going.
privacy dance.
All right.
Who's I'm sorry, Civil Liberties Union.
You have nothing to be sorry for. Next.
Edward Hasbrook with the Identity Project.
Lenny Goldberg, Privacy Rates Clearinghouse.
Okay. You had the benefit of the conversation that we had at the previous hearing, plus a little bit more follow-up today. So what concerns you? Let's start there.
Okay, Valerie Small-Navarro with the American Civil Liberties Union, and I will do my best not to repeat anything that has been said till now. I think one of the issues remains is what is the justification for the use of facial recognition. And I think we've been speaking with the DMV and trying to work with them and understand what their justification is, and to the best of our understanding, they are suggesting that in any given year, an additional 2,000 fraud investigations or fraud cases would be caught. And so I think that's sort of what we're looking at, and the baseline is currently 7,000 investigations. So I think that the question, the bang for the buck, we're going to put 25 million people in a database, facial recognition, in order to catch 2,000 more cases of fraud. The other point I'd like to make is this concern about access to the underlying database. I think the DMV is very sincere in telling us, well, we have all these technical reasons why law enforcement or other folks can't get into the database. The problem is the statute is very, very clear. So, and I can pass this out after I'm done, but the Vehicle Code Section 1810.5 basically says, law enforcement, attorney general, et cetera, shall have access, including but not limited to telephone access to the records of the department. So essentially, regardless of what the DMV may have in place or their desires or intent, I would suggest to you that this statute authorizes law enforcement to have access. And the question we have in terms of a First Amendment issue or just freedom of movement in our society is that if somebody chooses to scan people in a crowd, whether it's a anti-choice rally or a labor rally or whatever, and feed that information through the DMV database, those names and information will come up. So essentially, I think we have a real justification problem and a real privacy concern. And again, finally, that our Constitution, we really value the right to privacy. It's been written into our Constitution. It's not like other states where we just kind of find privacy in the penumbras of the Constitution. It is written into our Constitution, and I suggest that the burden really hasn't been met yet. Thank you.
All right, who's next?
I'm Edward Hasbrook with the Identity Project, papersplease.org. And we've been involved in the ID debate both with state real ID issues, but also at the federal level with ID for air transportation with the TSA, rail transportation with Amtrak. And I wanted to bring to you some of the issues raised from that experience that I think transcend the question of privacy, and I would frame more as issues of due process, and that I think particularly go to the issue that the chairman was raising of issues that will require not merely policy debate, but new statutory provisions to encompass them. Problems with federal system for air travel in imposing efforts to match people against some sort of database and use that as a screening mechanism have turned out to be, to an unanticipated degree, problems, one, of false positives and the number thereof, and two, of what to do with the false positives. And I think that's something that hasn't really been part of this debate yet. We found it somewhat difficult to get clear numbers, but based on both what was said by the DMV spokespeople at last week's assembly hearing and on some discussions that we had with them over the past week, in a couple different ways, it comes back to some hundreds of thousands, likely, of people, of incidents a year that they would anticipate, where a photo of a new or renewal applicant would be matched by the software, matched, so-called, against another photo, where in fact they were different people, but the software can't tell them apart. This would then trigger some kind of process which we've had difficulty getting the DMV to pin down. And again, this is the kind of Kafkaesque limbo that people erroneously matched against the no-fly list have been experiencing over past years, and we really would not like to see that experience repeated here. I apply for a license, the robot thinks I look like this other person. This is likely to occur more in California, I would point out, because the more photos in the database, the more likely that any new one is going to match one of those photos in the database. And now this person says they're me, I say I'm me. Somehow somebody has to make a decision. Who's the real you? And I, purely as a result of this software deployment and this biometric facial matching deployment, and again, we can anticipate this is going to happen to some hundreds of thousands of Californians every year, are essentially going to be placed by this system. Several hundred thousand a year, entirely innocent people, placed essentially in the situation of victims of identity theft, having to prove to somebody, and it's not clear whether that will be the contractor, the DMV, or the police, that they really are who they say they are, in some kind of competition with a con man or an identity thief who is probably a very persuasive person claiming that they're really me. This calls for both procedural and substantive due process standards which are lacking in the present statute. Intriguingly, the present statute does provide some such standards if, for example, the DMV proposes to cancel your license for medical disqualification. There are no such substantive or procedural standards, nor have they been able to produce any even from their procedures applicable to fraud investigations. It's really a bit of a black hole that you're thrown into in this situation. the DMV has told us they expect to be able to resolve most of these within a few days, and that in the meantime, people will have a paper non-photo temporary ID. And I would point out that while that may have been sufficient in the days when a driver's license was only needed to drive, that's not sufficient. With the deployment of Secure Flight by the federal government, which will be deployed by the end of 2010, you will be required to have a photo ID to fly. So denying you the permanent photo ID will effectively be an administrative sanction confining you within driving range. You won't be able to fly, you won't be able to get on an Amtrak train. And so there's, as the significance grows, there's a commensurate need for due process protections
Let me
there.
go to our next witness, and thank you, Armin.
Yes, Lenny Goldberg, Privacy Rights Clearinghouse. I'll try to be brief. But I want to say this committee and the Budget Committee really had a very good process here. We saw the letter that said, hey, we're just going to go ahead with this contract. We sat down with the committee, noticed that there were not any due process protections, any privacy protections. We did meet extensively with the DMV, and I appreciate their concerns about privacy on the one-to-many match that we're talking about. They said no one will have outside access to that database. However, as Ms. Small-Navarro pointed out, there are no statutory protections. There is no statutory language that makes sure that this works as the DMV projected that it would work. So as Mr. Lowenthal suggested, it will take hearing and statute and substantial language to say if we do this, and should, I think Mr. Hasbrook raised the question about whether we should do this, but if we do this, there is no statutory protection right now. So,
And the final witness.
Yes, Ignacio Hernandez on behalf of the Consumer Federation of California. Simply just agree with the comments that were already made by the witnesses. We think the privacy protections right now are incomplete, and we need a further discussion on those matters.
Before we let you away, since we have you at the table, so if somebody said to you, not any of us, but if somebody said to you, wouldn't this just be easier if we had a national identity card, and isn't that a good idea? What would you say, briefly?
No.
Your brevity is admirable. And if they said because why, you'd say?
Well, I think the real ID is a form of a national identity card. And I think the concerns that have been raised from people across the political spectrum, Republicans, Democrats, everyone, we are not a country of identity cards. The United States has prided ourselves in not being a country of national identity cards. So I think it would be a huge error to go down that path. I think it's one thing for each state to determine who gets a driver's license, who has an identity card. It's a totally different question to suggest that a whole country adopt a national standard and buy into the idea of a national identity card.
But if they were to ask you, where's the harm? What is the harm of saying, you know what, if we have 300 million Americans and we have to keep track of them and we need to know, for whether it's for a driver's license or access to public transportation or for medical benefits, what's the harm? And since we already have a de facto ID card in our driver's licenses, isn't it time to just say that debate's over and we ought to have one national card that people could actually use and that it would have some functionality and we could make it top of the line and we could rely on it and then that would be the thing?
I would ask you, Mr. Smithson, who is the we in that? Is that the FBI that holds the national identity card? Is it? I mean, the DMV is a functional card. Is that the Department of Justice? The State Department does have that to an extent with regard to passports and the ability to travel. But I do think that, and one of our objections to Real ID, and this is, maybe a little contradictory to my previous answer, was that having every state have access to your data is a real concern. We've seen we've seen very sloppy handling of data. So
one of the reasons I asked the question, which is the notion, with all due respect to Oklahoma, the notion that the entry-level DMV clerk at Tulsa, Oklahoma, in some way has the ability to access my information and do something with it is disconcerting to me, which is
I guess in the recent context, we haven't seen the privacy and civil liberties protection very strongly upheld by the federal government, and I think that's where major concern.
And the identity theft issue is the other part that you're seeing.
All right, any other questions from members of the committee? If not, we'll say thank you for your time here this morning. We'll ask the previous panel to come back. And Mr. Valverde, if you're coming up, let me just underscore what I think I heard from others as well, which is that you've made yourself very accessible for questions, folks who had concerns. I want to indicate that's been my experience over this last couple of months as well, and I appreciate that.
Thank you.
On your behalf. Same as well with representative of the vendor, Mr. Naylor, who's been nothing but accessible on this issue for quite some time. So thank you there again. Members, the staff recommendation is to approve the contract rather than to simply limit it to a one-year extension, which I think is less desirable from the department standpoint. Approve the contract, but prohibit the use of the biometric technology. And then, in addition,
facial recognition
biotechnology. That's right. And then, in addition, make the necessary technical changes to the contract amount to conform to the staff recommendation, and the staff will reconcile the dollar amounts after the fact. Senator Benoit on this point.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. And we've had a lot of discussion on this issue, and obviously there are some points of disagreement. I'd like to just briefly make an argument. Why I believe we should go forward with the contract in its current form. First, as a former law enforcement officer and meeting with a lot of people, and I assume that my colleagues have had the same experience in town halls over the last several years, separate from the budget issue perhaps, probably the single biggest issue that I've had town hall after town hall on and concerns brought to my office is the number one growing crime in the country, identity theft. It is extremely costly, difficult to prevent, difficult to prosecute, and frustrating to a whole lot of, I think, all of our constituents. And according to information I've received lately, California is perhaps the third highest incidence of identity theft of any state in the nation. It's maybe one of the few areas where we don't lead the nation. But we have a significant, huge problem with identity theft. This system we're talking about, which is, by the way, now in place in 26 states. So we are already in the minority for not having this kind of security in our system. 6 additional states are currently considering doing it. We will soon be one of the few states that does not have this kind of security in our driver's license administration process. This particular kind of system has gone into, as I said, 26 different states. One recent state was Nevada, where in the first quarter of operation of this system, the Nevada DMV investigated 356 potential fraud cases that came from this type of technology, made 29 arrests, canceled 136 driver's license. If you take the size of Nevada and apply that to the state of California, that would be approximately 14,240 cases in California, 1,160 arrests, and 5,400 driver's licenses canceled. That's the scope of the potential number of fraudulent applications.
I just think we have more honest people in California, though, Mr. Benoit, to temper those numbers.
Well, it's a huge problem, and it's potentially a very cost-effective solution to many, many cases of identity theft. As we move forward on this decision, I think it's worthy of discussion and thought that if we don't invoke this kind of technology, we will soon be one of the least effective, most open systems to fraud in the nation for driver's licenses. And it's an axiom in the law enforcement community: if you leave the door open, someone's going to come in and steal it, whatever it is. We don't really want to be in a position of being the state where it's known amongst those who would try to get false IDs. It's the easiest place to go to get one. And that's where we're going to potentially end up being if we don't do what 26 other states have done and 6 others are currently looking at, and obviously the industry is moving towards. So I suggest that it's an issue that needs to be moved forward soon. I don't discount some of the concerns have been made about our policies perhaps still lagging behind. I would suggest, and I'd like to make an alternative motion on this issue, Mr. Chairman, that we go forward with the procurement as originally designed, but prohibit the DMV from using that biometric data until such time as the legislature approves of policies outlined here that we need to be drafted to clearly clarify for your concerns and others how this information should be used.
All right. Senator Benoit has put a motion on the floor. There is no motion pending, because I don't think we actually got a formal motion.
Sorry. Okay.
So your motion is now on the floor, and it's appropriate for debate and action. Senator Lowenthal?
Yeah, I think we all have some of the same concerns that Senator Benoit has. But in my listening to the testimony from the DMV, it seems like the initial recommendation prohibiting the use of facial recognition technology, that there are ways now that if we did that, we can still continue on and negotiate, and they can renegotiate their contracts, most likely not causing a great delay, and that if after we hear this policy decision, after we hear this and we have a policy debate on the issue, that we can look at what kinds of technologies may be employed in full vetting, such as without having some of the concerns potentially of privacy violations, such as increasing the number of fingerprints, which I've also heard this morning, which I had not, that too may provide the same amount of protection, if not more protection, in terms of protecting or providing the DMV with engaging in finding out which are fraudulent and which are not. And so I think that this really needs to be debated in the policy committee, and it seems to me by the original recommendation we do not lose any time, nor does DMV. And so I will not support this because I don't think it adds anything to what we're already doing. I think by prohibiting it and then by asking, or if waiting until a policy committee deals with this issue by having legislation proposed, does not slow us down any more than what you're proposing, which would need the same process. And so I just don't see what your proposal adds.
I will also be a no vote, but I think both this discussion and the previous discussion, including the discussion prompted by Senator Benoit's motion and previous comments, is exactly the way a subcommittee like this ought to work, that it teases out issues that are important for the legislature at a larger level to address, identifies areas where it would be either inappropriate or premature to spend funds without that further debate and deliberation. So I for one am thinking that this is what the committee actually can do when we're not under the gun to march through 87 items in a single day in an hour and a half period of time. But why don't we ask that the staff call the roll on motion by Benoit as made.
Simonian?
No.
Benoit?
Aye.
Lowenthal?
No.
Okay, that measure fails on a 2-to-1 vote. The staff recommendation, again, which the chair supports and would gratefully entertain a motion for, is to approve the contract and prohibit the use of biometric facial technology. In addition, make the necessary technology change to the contract amount to conform to the staff recommendation.
Do we want to say biometric or just approve the contract and prohibit the use of facial recognition technology?
Well, there actually is. I think we need to be a little careful in our language because right now you take a picture and that's a facial technology and you use it.
Mr. Chairman,
sure we say this exactly.
I want to make sure, yes. I'm glad you raised this because if you think about what we currently do, we capture thumb, we capture signature, and we capture face, all of which constitute a biometric. What you're proposing would deal with a particular software, which is the facial recognition software.
So we would say approve the contract and prohibit the use of facial recognition software. Does that meet our needs?
Mr. Jackian, what do you think?
That's essentially the issue. I mean, it's how you're analyzing the photographs.
As a member of my staff. So does the use of facial recognition software, is that specific to the task? allowing the DMV to continue to take their pictures as they have, but precluding them?
I'm generally comfortable with that. I may say using computer analysis just so we cover all.
We're going to say facial recognition software today, subject to staff working to clarify the language for the committee and with the department, if the members of the committee are comfortable with that much flexibility and sheer raw power vested in our staff on our part. Okay.
Mr. Chairman, just one point of clarification. As Senator Lowenthal indicated, proceeding with a contract and, with the modification, certainly the department can do that. Doing it in the context without consideration for the facial recognition would, that would be the approach we would take based on your recommendation. However, if at a later date, the policy, we all agree on a policy to proceed that might warrant incorporation of it, may make it more difficult for us to do it within the context of our current contract. What the costs would be, could be different than what we're currently, suggesting in the current context. If I
were you, I'd take yes for an answer, sir.
I'll take your answer. Thank you.
I don't want to cut your remarks off, but this chair is stretching to get to the point where he's ready to do something beyond a one-year extension, and individual members are, I suspect, somewhere along a continuum on these privacy issues, but you've shown up with. You've shown up with a proposal which the need for which has not been demonstrated in my judgment, the effectiveness which has not been generated in my judgment, the protections for which are not in place, and it's not entirely clear to me that you have statutory authority to do this. With all that going against you, the chair and the members of the committee have said, we're prepared to go ahead and approve your contract. Just ask you to siphon that part off until such time as those issues get addressed and other options are looked at. I think that's a pretty good outcome, and not a lot of sympathy for any challenge that may pose in the aftermath. Okay. Anything else on your part?
No.
I think we have a motion from Senator Lowenthal, and we'll ask the staff to call the roll.
Simitian?
Aye.
Benoit?
No.
Lowenthal?
Aye.
That measure passes 2-1. Congratulations, Mr. Valverde. That takes us then to the driver's license fee increase for card contract and real ID. The staff will reconcile, the recommendation is that the staff would reconcile with the Legislative Analyst's Office, the DMV, and the Department of Finance for the actual amount of a fee increase necessary to conform to the action we just took. So obviously there were cost implications associated with a piece of the product not purchased, and we're simply talking here about conforming the price tag. Any comments from the DMV? LAO, does that sound good to you?
Well, there may also be a portion of the fee increase that's related to the Real ID proposal that is now off the table. We would also need to reconcile for that.
Thank you for that reminder, and I think yes, that was referenced in the previous staff recommendation where we indicated that the staff will reconcile the dollar amount on the contract. But you're talking about the Real ID, the budget change proposal having been pulled back as well. Okay.
Yeah, if I may, Mr. Chair. Yeah, it was always our intent to index the fee to what was needed for these two proposals. It broke about $2 for the DLID and about $1 for Real ID. So we will work with staff to appropriately
Staff recommendation to reflect that.
So the staff recommendation is that the staff will reconcile with the LAO, the DMV, and the Department of Finance for the actual amount of the fee increase necessary to conform to the action in Issue 1, which was the facial recognition software, as well as Real ID. Why don't we just resolve it that way? Okay. Do we get a motion to that effect?
Move.
Motion by Lowenthal.
Simitian?
Aye.
Benoit?
No.
Lowenthal?
Aye.
And that passes on a 2-1. And the final one is construction or renovation of state-owned facilities. We have a capital outlay BCP here. However, and the staff recommends, and the chair is prepared to support that capital outlay BCP. However, there is a note from the staff that the DMV should be mindful that the legislature may have to revisit this BCP given the state's overall cash and budgetary situation, which looks even worse today than it did the last time we spoke. That being said, I gather that you would like us to go ahead and adopt the capital outlay BCP with these, what is it, 8 items, I believe? Is that correct?
Yes.
Great. Any presentation on those? I think the staff report did a nice job in the agenda of making the case that you've tried to use money wisely, been relatively limited and frugal, redesigned rather than simply found new facilities. So
I move that we adopt the capital outlay BCP.
any witnesses on this item? If not, any further conversation by members of the committee? Call the roll.
Simonian,
Aye.
Benoit,
Aye.
Lowenthal.
Aye.
That passes 3-0. I believe that is the last item for action on our agenda. And unless there's a dire need by a member of the committee to have discussion on any of the potential information items, without objection, the meeting is adjourned. Thank you all very much.
Thank you.